The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as hundreds of tourists gathered to witness the changing of the guard ceremony. It was a Tuesday in late September, and the autumn air carried a crisp coolness that made the day perfect for sightseeing. Families with children, elderly couples, and groups of friends from around the world had positioned themselves behind the protective barriers. Cameras and phones ready to capture the ancient tradition that had been performed for centuries. Among the crowd stood Thomas Mitchell, 42-year-old construction worker from Manchester, who had come to London for what was supposed to be a celebration. His younger brother had just gotten married, and the bachelor party had stretched in two. Its third day. Thomas had always been a heavy drinker, but the past few days had pushed him far beyond his usual limits. His eyes were bloodshot, his speech was slurred, and his coordination was noticeably impaired as he swayed slightly while standing among the spectators. The royal guards stood at attention in their iconic red uniforms and tall bearskin hats, their faces stoic and professional despite the chaos of tourists around them. These men and women were among the most disciplined soldiers in the world, selected not only for their military excellence, but also for their ability to maintain composure. Under any circumstances, they had trained for years to ignore distractions, insults, and even physical provocations while protecting the royal family and maintaining the dignity of their ancient traditions. Sergeant William Hayes stood at his post near the main entrance. His rifle held at the perfect angle, his posture ramrod straight, despite having been motionless for nearly an hour. At 28 years old, he had served in Afghanistan before earning his position with the Queen's Guard. His military record was exemplary, marked by commendations for bravery and leadership under fire. The precision and discipline required. For his current role came naturally after years of combat experience where attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. Thomas had been drinking since early morning, starting with beer at breakfast and progressing to whiskey. Shots by noon. His friends had tried to convince him to return to the hotel and sleep it off, but he had insisted on seeing the famous guards he had heard so much about. The alcohol had lowered his inhibitions and clouded his judgment, making him increasingly bold and reckless as the day progressed. He pushed through the crowd, muttering complaints about tourists and foreigners, his voice growing louder and more aggressive with each passing minute. The ceremony began with the familiar sound of military commands echoing across the courtyard. The guards moved with mechanical precision, their synchronized steps creating a rhythmic cadence that had remained unchanged for generations. Tourists raised their cameras and phones, capturing every moment of the spectacle while maintaining a respectful distance behind the barriers that separated them from the performers. Thomas watched the ceremony with growing irritation, his alcohol impaired, mind fixating on what he perceived as an elaborate show put on for tourists. He began making loud comments about the guards being nothing more than actors in costumes, his voice carrying over the respectful silence of the other spectators. Several people nearby glanced at him with disapproval, but the guards continued their duties without any visible reaction to his disruptions. As the ceremony continued, Thomas became increasingly agitated by the guards' apparent indifference to his presence. In his drunken state, he interpreted their professional composure as arrogance and disrespect. He had spent his entire adult life in environments where confrontation was common, and backing down was seen as weakness. The construction sites where he worked were filled with men who settled disputes with raised voices and physical posturing, and he couldn't understand why these soldiers weren't responding to his provocations. The crowd around Thomas began to shift uncomfortably as his comments became more frequent and aggressive. Parents pulled their children closer. Elderly tourists moved away from his immediate vicinity, and several people began recording his behavior with their phones. The atmosphere in his section of the crowd became tense as spectators realized they were witnessing something that could quickly spiral out of control. Sergeant Hayes maintained his position and composure, despite being aware of the drunk man's increasing hostility. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. Tourists who didn't understand or respect the solemnity of their duties were common, and dealing with them professionally was part of the job. He had learned to filter out distractions and focus on his responsibilities. Regardless of what was happening in the crowd around him, Thomas's frustration reached a boiling point. When one of the guards executed a particularly precise drill movement that drew applause from the crowd, the combination of alcohol, exhaustion from days of partying, and his growing anger at being ignored created a perfect storm of poor judgment. He began shouting more loudly, demanding that the guards acknowledge him and respond to his presence. His words were slurred, but his hostility was unmistakable. The situation escalated when Thomas decided that the barriers separating him from the guards were simply suggestions rather than necessary security measures. Told him that he had every right as a tax-paying citizen to get closer to the soldiers who were supposedly serving his country. He began pushing against the barrier, testing its stability and looking for a way around the security measures that had been put in place to protect both the guards and the way.art. Spectators, other tourists began backing away from Thomas as his behavior became more erratic and threatening. Security personnel stationed around the perimeter of the ceremony began moving closer to his location. Recognizing the signs of a potential incident that could disrupt the ceremony and endanger both the guards and the innocent bystanders who had come to enjoy a peaceful cultural experience, the moment came without warning. Thomas, emboldened by alcohol and frustrated by what he perceived as the guards' arrogant silence, made a decision that would change everything with surprising speed for someone in his intoxicated condition. He ducked under the barrier and stumbled toward Sergeant Hayes. The crowd gasped collectively as they realized what was happening. But Thomas was moving too quickly for anyone to stop him. His rough, calloused hands reached out and grabbed Sergeant Hayes by the sleeve of his pristine red uniform. The contact was shocking in its audacity. Tourists from around the world had traveled thousands of miles to see these guards, and everyone understood that touching them was absolutely forbidden. The ancient protocol that governed their duties was sacred, and Thomas had just violated one of the most fundamental rules that protected both the ceremony and the soldiers who performed it. Sergeant Hayes felt the grip on his uniform but maintained his composure with remarkable discipline. Years of military training had taught him to assess threats quickly and respond appropriately. His mind instantly categorized Thomas as a drunk civilian rather than a genuine security threat, which meant his response needed to be measured and professional rather than aggressive. The sergeant's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but every muscle in his body was ready to react if the situation escalated further. The crowd around them fell into an eerie silence as hundreds of people processed what they were witnessing. Children stopped chattering. Cameras lowered slightly as their operators forgot to keep recording. Conversations died mid-sentence as everyone focused on the confrontation unfolding before them. The only sounds were Thomas's heavy breathing and the distant traffic from the streets surrounding the palace grounds. Thomas expected the guard to break character, to shout at him or push him away, but Sergeant Hayes remained motionless. This unexpected reaction confused and frustrated the drunk man even more. In his impaired state, couldn't understand that the guard's stillness was not weakness, but rather the ultimate display of professional discipline. Thomas tightened his grip on the uniform and began shaking the sergeant's arm, demanding some kind of response. Other guards in the ceremony maintained their positions despite the disruption, demonstrating the same incredible discipline that had made the Queen's Guard famous worldwide. They were aware of the situation but trusted their colleague to handle it appropriately. Their training emphasized that breaking formation would only make the situation worse and could encourage other disruptive behavior from the crowd. Palace security. Officers began moving through the crowd toward the disturbance, their approach careful and measured to avoid causing panic among the innocent tourists. They wore plain clothes and moved discreetly, positioning themselves to intervene quickly if necessary. While allowing the guard to handle the situation according to his training, these security professionals had dealt with similar incidents before and understood the delicate balance between maintaining order and preserving the dignity of the ceremony. Thomas's grip on Sergeant Hayes grew stronger as his frustration mounted. The alcohol in his system made him increasingly aggressive and unpredictable. He began shouting directly at the guard, his face inches away from the sergeant's stoic profile. His words were a mixture of profanity, challenges to fight, and confused complaints about taxes and military service. The contrast between his loud, crude behavior and the guard's silent dignity was stark and unsettling. The tourists who had been closest to Thomas when he broke through the barrier began moving away, creating a widening circle of space around the confrontation. Parents covered their children's eyes or ears, while others continued recording, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary and potentially dangerous. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation as everyone wondered what would happen next. Sergeant Hayes could feel Thomas's breath on his face and smell the alcohol that had fueled this confrontation. His training had prepared him for hostile environments and life-threatening situations. But dealing with a drunk civilian in front of hundreds of tourists required a different kind of courage and self-control. Every instinct told him to defend himself, but his duty demanded that he maintain the dignity and professionalism that his uniform represented. The sergeant's mind raced through his options, while his body remained perfectly still. He could easily overpower Thomas if necessary. His military training and physical fitness far exceeded that of an intoxicated construction worker. However, using force would likely escalate the situation, and could result in serious injury to a civilian who was more foolish than dangerous. The guard's responsibility was to protect not just the royal family and the ceremony, but also the safety of everyone present, including the man who was currently assaulting him. Thomas became increasingly frustrated by the guard's lack of response. In his drunken logic, he couldn't comprehend that silence could be a form of strength rather than weakness. He had expected shouting, pushing, or some kind of dramatic confrontation that would validate his alcohol-fueled bravado. Instead, he found himself grabbing onto a man who seemed as unmovable and unshakable as a statue. The crowd watched in fascination and horror as Thomas continued his one-sided assault on the guard. Some tourists began whispering among themselves, speculating about what they were witnessing and what might happen next. Others remained silent, recognizing the gravity of the situation and the remarkable self-control being displayed by Sergeant Hayes. Security cameras, positioned around the palace grounds, captured every moment of the incident, providing multiple angles of Thomas's aggression and the guard's professional response. These recordings would later be analyzed by security experts and used as training materials to demonstrate proper protocol in similar situations. The incident was being documented not just by tourists' personal cameras, but by the sophisticated surveillance system that protected one of the most important buildings in the country. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. Instead of becoming angry or violent, instead of breaking his composure or abandoning his post, Sergeant Hayes did something completely unexpected. With Thomas still gripping his uniform and shouting profanities inches from his face, the guard slowly and deliberately turned his head to look directly at the drunk man. His movement was so controlled and precise that it seemed almost mechanical, like a statue coming to life. The eye contact between the two men lasted only a few seconds, but it carried the weight of centuries of military tradition and personal discipline. Sergeant Hayes's eyes were calm but intense, showing no fear, no anger, and no weakness. Instead, they conveyed a depth of character and strength that transcended physical power. It was the look of a man who had faced enemy fire in combat zones, who had carried wounded comrades to safety, and who understood what true courage meant. Thomas felt something shift in that moment of eye contact. The alcohol that had been fueling his bravado suddenly seemed to evaporate, replaced by a growing awareness of what he had done and who he was dealing with. This wasn't just a man in a costume performing for tourists. This was a trained soldier who was choosing restraint over retaliation, discipline over anger. The drunk man's grip on the uniform loosened slightly as confusion replaced aggression. The sergeant's gaze held. Thomas transfixed for several heartbeats before he slowly turned, his head back to its original position, resuming his formal stance. The movement was so smooth and controlled that it seemed almost choreographed, but everyone watching understood that they had witnessed something profound. Without saying a single word or raising a hand in anger, Sergeant Hayes had demonstrated a form of power that was far more impressive than any physical retaliation could have been. The crowd around them remained frozen in stunned silence. Many of the tourists had expected violence or at least some kind of dramatic confrontation, but instead they had witnessed something far more powerful, the ultimate display of self-control and professional dignity. Children who had been watching Wide-eyed began to understand that they were seeing something important. Even if they couldn't fully comprehend what it meant, Thomas stood there for several more seconds, his hands still touching the guard's uniform, but his aggressive energy completely deflated. The eye contact had sobered him more effectively than any amount of coffee or cold water could have. He began to realize the magnitude of his actions. He had assaulted a soldier who was serving his country, violated sacred traditions that stretched back centuries, and disrespected an institution that millions of people revered. Palace security officers had positioned themselves within striking distance of Thomas, ready to intervene if necessary. However, they recognized that Sergeant Hayes had handled the situation masterfully. The guard's response had de-escalated a potentially dangerous confrontation without violence or drama. The drunk man was clearly no longer a threat. His aggression had been completely neutralized by nothing more than a look and the quiet dignity of a professional soldier. As Thomas finally released his grip on the sergeant's uniform, he took a stumbling step backward. The alcohol was still in his system, but his clarity of mind was returning as he processed what had just occurred. He looked around at the hundreds of faces staring at him with expressions ranging from disgust to pity to amazement. Of their judgment began to penetrate his alcohol-clouded consciousness. Sergeant Hayes remained at his post. His uniform slightly wrinkled from Thomas's grip, but his composure completely intact. The brief interaction had not shaken his focus or commitment to his duties. If anything, his handling of the situation had elevated him in the eyes of everyone present. He had proven that true strength came not from the ability to inflict harm, but from the wisdom to know when restraint was the more powerful choice. The other guards in the ceremony continued their duties as if nothing had happened, their discipline matching that of their colleague. This collective professionalism reinforced the message that Thomas had encountered something far larger than any individual soldier. He had confronted an institution built on centuries of tradition, honor, and unwavering commitment to duty. Thomas began backing away from Sergeant Hayes, his movements unsteady, but his aggressive intentions clearly abandoned. The circle of tourists around him remained wide, giving him space, but also isolating him from the respectful crowd, who had come to appreciate rather than assault the ceremony. He could feel hundreds of eyes following his every move, and the shame began to cut through his intoxication. The security officers moved closer, but did not immediately apprehend Thomas. They recognized that the immediate threat had passed, and that Sergeant Hayes had diffused the situation more effectively than any physical intervention could have. Their job now was to ensure that Thomas left the area without causing further disruption while allowing the ceremony to continue with minimal interruption. The silence in the crowd began to break as people started whispering among themselves about what they had witnessed. Many were in awe of the guard's restraint and professionalism, while others were shocked by Thomas's behavior and the disrespect he had shown. The incident was already being uploaded to social media by dozens of witnesses, ensuring that the story would spread far beyond the palace grounds. Thomas felt the full weight of his actions, settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. The brief moment of eye contact with Sergeant Hayes had stripped away his alcohol-fueled delusions and forced him to confront the reality of his behavior. He had expected to provoke a reaction, to prove some point about authority and power, but instead he had been shown what real strength looked like, and it bore no resemblance to his own crude aggression. As Thomas stumbled backward, the full reality of his situation began to dawn on him. The alcohol that had given him false courage now seemed to abandon him completely, leaving him face to face with the enormity of what he had done. He had not only assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard, but had done so in front of hundreds of witnesses and countless recording devices. The shame hit him like a physical blow, causing his shoulders to slump and his defiant posture to crumble. The palace security officers approached Thomas with professional calm, their movements measured and non-threatening despite the seriousness of the situation. They had witnessed Sergeant Hayes' masterful handling of the confrontation and understood that further aggression would be counterproductive. Their approach was designed to remove Thomas from the scene while maintaining the dignity that the guard had worked so hard to preserve. The lead security officer, Inspector David Crawford, had 20 years of experience dealing with incidents at royal properties. He had seen tourists make mistakes, protesters attempt disruptions, and mentally unstable individuals breach security perimeters. However, Thomas's case was different. This was a man whose poor judgment had led him to cross a line he never should have approached, but who was clearly beginning to understand the gravity of his actions. Thomas offered no resistance as the security officers guided him away from Sergeant Hayes and toward the edge of the ceremony area. Legs felt unsteady. But whether from alcohol or the emotional impact of his encounter with the guard, he couldn't tell. The crowd parted silently as they moved, creating a corridor of disapproving faces and recording devices that captured every step of his walk of shame. Inspector Crawford spoke quietly to Thomas as they walked, his voice professional, but not unkind. He explained that Thomas would need to be processed for assault charges and that his actions had been recorded by multiple security cameras. However, the inspector also noted that Sergeant Hayes had handled the situation with remarkable restraint, which might influence how the incident would be prosecuted. The ceremony continued behind them, the other guards maintaining their posts and duties with the same unwavering professionalism that Sergeant Hayes had displayed. Their collective discipline sent a clear message to the remaining tourists. This was an institution that could not be shaken by the poor judgment of individuals. The ancient traditions would continue regardless of momentary disruptions. Thomas found himself in a small security office adjacent to the palace grounds. Sitting in a plain metal chair while Inspector Crawford completed his initial report, office was simple and functional, with white walls decorated only by official photographs and safety notices. The stark environment was a sharp contrast to the grandeur of the palace grounds and served as a sobering reminder that Thomas had crossed from the world of tourism into the realm of law enforcement as the immediate adrenaline of the confrontation faded. Thomas began to process what had happened during those crucial moments with Sergeant Hayes. The guard's eye contact had been brief but profound, and carrying a message that transcended words. It had been a look of disappointment rather than anger, of professional duty maintained despite personal provocation, of strength demonstrated through restraint rather than retaliation. The alcohol was slowly leaving Thomas's system, replaced by a growing sense of remorse and embarrassment. He began to remember fragments of his military history lessons from school, understanding for the first time the significance of the traditions he had violated. The Queen's Guard wasn't just a tourist attraction, it was a living symbol of centuries of military service, sacrifice, and honor. Inspector Crawford returned to the office with Thomas's identification documents and began the formal process of documenting the incident. He explained that Thomas would be charged with assault and public disorder, charges that carried potential jail time and significant fines. More importantly, the incident had been witnessed by hundreds of people and would likely become international news within hours. Thomas thought about his family back in Manchester, his wife, his teenage children, his elderly parents who had always been proud of his work ethic despite his drinking problems. They would see the news coverage, read about his behavior, and have to live with the shame and embarrassment he had brought upon them. The weight of that realization was more crushing than any legal consequence he might face. The security office had a small television that was tuned to a local news channel. Thomas watched in horror as early reports of the incident began to appear. The footage showed him grabbing Sergeant Hayes, shouting at the stoic guard, and then backing away after that pivotal moment of eye contact. The contrast between his aggressive behavior and the guard's dignified response was stark and humiliating. Inspector Crawford noticed Thomas watching the news coverage and turned down the volume. He had processed hundreds of similar cases over his career, but few involved individuals who seemed to genuinely grasp the significance of their actions as quickly as Thomas was beginning to understand. The inspector had seen the moment when the drunk man's aggression had crumbled in the face of the guard's quiet strength. As the formal processing continued, Thomas found himself thinking about Sergeant Hayes standing alone at his post, maintaining his duties despite what had just occurred. The guard had not sought sympathy, recognition, or support from his colleagues. He had simply absorbed the assault and responded with a dignity that Thomas was beginning to realize he had never possessed himself. The news coverage expanded to include interviews with tourists who had witnessed the incident. Their descriptions of Sergeant Hayes's professionalism and restraint painted a picture of a soldier who embodied the best qualities of military service. In contrast, their descriptions of Thomas's behavior were unflattering and embarrassing. Highlighting the stark difference between the two men's characters, Thomas began to understand that his encounter with Sergeant Hayes had revealed something fundamental about himself that he had been avoiding for years: his drinking, his aggressive tendencies, his inability to show respect for authority or tradition. All of these flaws had been exposed in that single moment. When he grabbed the guard's uniform, the alcohol had stripped away his inhibitions, but it had also revealed the man he had become. The news of the incident spread across social media platforms with unprecedented speed. Within 2 hours of Thomas's assault on Sergeant Hayes, video clips from dozens of different angles were being shared millions of times across Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. The footage showed not just the physical confrontation, but more importantly, the remarkable restraint and dignity displayed by the Royal Guard in response to the unprovoked attack. Thomas's mugshot appeared on news websites around the world, alongside headlines that ranged from sympathetic analyses of alcoholism and poor decision-making, too harsh criticisms of British drinking culture and tourist behavior. The story resonated with people globally because it represented a clash between two fundamentally different approaches to conflict, one based on aggression and entitlement, the other grounded in discipline and honor. Back in Manchester, Thomas's family was devastated by the news coverage. His wife Sarah had been married to him for 18 years and had watched his drinking steadily worsen over time. She had made excuses for his behavior, covered for his mistakes, and hoped that he would eventually recognize the damage he was causing to himself and their family. The incident at the palace was the culmination of years of increasingly poor judgment fueled by alcohol. Their teenage children, Emma and James, faced immediate consequences at school as their classmates discovered their father's international humiliation. The video of Thomas grabbing the guard was being shared in their social media groups, accompanied by mocking comments and cruel jokes. The teenagers were forced to confront the reality that their father's problems had moved far beyond embarrassing them at family gatherings. His behavior now reflected on them in the most public way possible. Meanwhile, Sergeant Hayes continued his duties at the palace with the same professionalism he had always demonstrated. He refused interview requests from news organizations and declined to make any public statements about the incident. His silence wasn't born from secrecy or resentment, but from a deep understanding that his job was to serve with dignity rather than to seek attention or sympathy for doing his duty. The military community rallied around Sergeant Hayes, recognizing in his response the embodiment of everything they valued about professional service. Veterans from around the world shared the video with pride, using it as an example of how soldiers should conduct themselves even under provocation. His restraint became a teaching moment in military academies and police training programs globally. Thomas spent his first night in custody in a small holding cell, his mind clearing as the alcohol finally worked its way out of his system. Stark concrete walls and basic facilities gave him time to reflect on the chain of decisions that had led him to this point. He thought about the moment when Sergeant Hayes had looked directly at him, not with anger or hatred, but with a kind of profound disappointment that cut deeper than any punishment could. The legal proceedings began the following morning when Thomas appeared before a magistrate to face formal charges. His court-appointed lawyer explained that the assault had been captured on multiple cameras and witnessed by hundreds of people, making a defense based on denial impossible. The evidence was overwhelming, and Thomas's best option was to plead guilty and hope for leniency based on his intoxication and lack of previous serious offenses. As Thomas sat in the courtroom waiting for his case to be called, he watched other defendants appear before the judge for various offenses. He noticed the difference between those who showed genuine remorse for their actions and those who made excuses or blamed circumstances beyond their control. For the first time in his adult life, he began to take full responsibility for his behavior and its consequences. The magistrate who handled Thomas's case had seen thousands of alcohol-related offenses during her 20-year career on the bench. However, The defendant before her represented something different. His assault on a royal guard had been witnessed by people around the world, and his victim's response had demonstrated qualities of character that made the crime seem even more serious by comparison. Thomas's guilty plea was accepted, and he was sentenced to 6 months in prison, suspended for 2 years, along with a substantial fine and mandatory alcohol treatment programs. The magistrate noted that while his actions were serious and had brought shame on his country, the suspended sentence reflected both his guilty plea and the exemplary manner in which the victim had handled the assault. The international media coverage of the incident continued for weeks, but the focus gradually shifted from Thomas's criminal behavior to the broader lessons about character, discipline, and the difference between strength and aggression. Sergeant Hayes became an unlikely symbol of military professionalism, while Thomas became a cautionary tale about the consequences of alcohol abuse and poor decision-making. Thomas returned to Manchester to face a community that had seen him become internationally famous for all the wrong reasons. His construction company terminated his employment, citing the negative publicity and their concerns about his reliability and judgment. Local pubs refused to serve him, not out of cruelty but because his presence reminded everyone of the embarrassment he had brought to their community. The most painful consequence for Thomas was watching his family struggle with the aftermath of his actions. His wife Sarah began attending Al-Anon meetings for families of alcoholics, finally acknowledging that she couldn't fix her husband's problems or protect their children from the consequences of his behavior. His relationship with Emma and James became strained as they dealt with the social consequences of having a father who had become an international symbol of poor judgment. During the long, sleepless nights that followed his return home, Thomas found himself repeatedly thinking about Sergeant Hayes. The guard had faced aggression with composure, insults with silence, and physical assault with restraint. In that brief moment of eye contact, the soldier had shown Thomas what real strength looked like, and it bore no resemblance to anything he had ever demonstrated in his own life. Thomas began to understand that his encounter with the Royal Guard had been more than just a drunken mistake. It had been a confrontation between two completely different philosophies of life. Sergeant Hayes represented discipline, service, honor, and the strength to maintain one's principles even under attack. Thomas represented the opposite, a man who had allowed alcohol to erode his character until he was capable of attacking someone whose only crime was doing his duty with dignity. 6 months after the incident at the palace, Thomas Mitchell sat in a circle of folding chairs in the basement of a Manchester community center, participating in his court-mandated Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, the familiar ritual of sharing stories and acknowledging failures had become a cornerstone of his attempts to rebuild his life. But the shadow of his international humiliation continued to follow him everywhere he went. The AA group had initially been skeptical of Thomas, assuming he was there only because the court required it rather than from genuine desire for change. However, over the weeks and months of regular attendance, they began to see something different in him. His shame over the palace incident seemed to have cracked open something deeper, a recognition that his drinking had been destroying not just his own life, but the lives of everyone who cared about him. When Thomas finally felt ready to share his story with the group, he didn't focus on the legal consequences or the media attention. Instead, he talked about the moment when Sergeant Hayes had looked directly at him, and how that brief eye contact had shown him the difference between a man of character and someone who had lost his way completely. The guard's restraint had demonstrated a form of strength that Thomas was only beginning to understand. His sponsor, Robert, was a former military man who had struggled with alcohol after returning from deployment overseas. Robert understood both the military culture that had shaped Sergeant Hayes and the destructive power of alcohol that had controlled Thomas. Their conversations often focused on the concept of honor, not as an abstract ideal, but as a daily choice to do the right thing regardless of personal cost or convenience. Thomas's relationship with his family remained fractured, but was slowly showing signs of healing. Sarah had stopped making excuses for his behavior and had begun setting clear boundaries about what she would and would not accept going forward. The children, Emma and James, were still embarrassed by their father's actions, but they could see genuine changes in his behavior and attitude. That gave them hope for the future. Finding employment proved to be one of Thomas's greatest challenges. The video of his assault on the Royal Guard was easily discoverable by any potential employer who searched his name online. Construction companies, retail stores, and even manual labor positions were reluctant to hire someone whose face had become synonymous with public drunkenness and poor judgment. The practical consequences of his actions extended far beyond the legal penalties. However, Thomas eventually found work with a small landscaping company owned by another recovering alcoholic who believed in second chances. The job paid less than his previous construction work, but it provided him with the dignity of honest labor and the opportunity to prove that he was committed to changing his life. His new employer had one simple rule. Any sign of drinking would result in immediate termination. The media attention surrounding the incident gradually faded, but Thomas continued to receive occasional messages through social media from people around the world who had seen the video. Most were critical, but some were surprisingly supportive, sharing their own stories of alcoholism and recovery. A few veterans wrote to tell him that Sergeant Hayes's response had become a teaching example in military training programs about maintaining professionalism under pressure. Sergeant Hayes, meanwhile, continued his duties at the palace with the same quiet dignity that had made him famous. He had been promoted to staff sergeant in recognition of his exemplary service, but he remained humble about his role in the incident that had brought him international attention. When pressed by journalists or military publications for comments about the encounter, he consistently deflected attention away from himself and toward the institution he served. The palace incident had become a case study in conflict resolution and professional behavior studied in police academies, military schools, and business leadership programs around the world. Sergeant Hayes's response demonstrated that true strength often lay in restraint rather than retaliation, and that maintaining one's principles under pressure was the mark of genuine character. For Thomas, the path to redemption was long and difficult, marked by daily choices to stay sober and behave with integrity. He began volunteering at local schools to speak about the dangers of alcohol abuse, using his own story as a cautionary tale. The irony wasn't lost on him that his moment of greatest shame had become the foundation for trying to help others avoid similar mistakes. 2 years after the incident, Thomas received an unexpected letter that would change his perspective on everything that had happened. The return address showed it was from the Ministry of Defense, and his hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a brief, handwritten note from Sergeant Hayes himself. The letter was simple and direct, expressing hope that Thomas had found the help he needed and was rebuilding his life successfully. Sergeant Hayes wrote that he bore no ill will toward Thomas and understood that alcohol addiction was a serious disease that required treatment and support. He encouraged Thomas to continue his recovery and to use his experience to help others who might be struggling with similar problems. The letter concluded with words that Thomas would never forget. True strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up and choosing to be better than you were before. I hope you find the peace and purpose that everyone deserves. The message was signed simply, W. Hayes, Staff Sergeant. Thomas read the letter dozens of times each, reading bringing new tears and new understanding. Sergeant Hayes had not only shown remarkable restraint during their confrontation, but it also demonstrated extraordinary grace and forgiveness in reaching out to the man who had assaulted him. It was a final lesson in character that would guide Thomas for the rest of his life. The incident at the palace had lasted only a few minutes, but its impact would resonate for years to come. For Sergeant Hayes, it became a defining moment that illustrated the power of maintaining one's principles under extreme pressure. His response had inspired countless people around the world and had become a standard example of professional military conduct. For Thomas, the confrontation had marked the beginning of the most difficult and important journey of his life, the path from addiction and shame towards sobriety and redemption. The letter from Sergeant Hayes became his most treasured possession, a reminder that even someone who had been wronged could choose forgiveness and hope over anger and retribution. Years later, when people asked Thomas about his recovery and what had motivated him to change his life, he would tell them about a moment of eye contact with a royal guard who had shown him what real strength looked like. He would explain how one man's restraint and dignity had taught him more about character than all the lectures, punishments, and consequences combined. The video of the incident continued to circulate online, but its meaning had evolved over time. Instead of just being a cautionary tale about alcohol and poor judgment, it had become a powerful example of how grace under pressure could transform not just the person displaying it, but everyone who witnessed it. Sergeant Hayes had not just protected the dignity of his uniform and institution, he had planted seeds of redemption in the heart of the man who had attacked him. Thomas's children eventually came to understand that their father's public humiliation had been the catalyst for his recovery and transformation. They learned to be proud not of the man who had drunkenly assaulted a soldier, but of the man who had chosen to face his demons and build a better life from the wreckage of his mistakes. The story of the drunk man and the royal guard became more than just a viral video or a news story. It became a testament to the power of forgiveness, the possibility of redemption, and the profound impact that one person's character can have on another's destiny. In a world full of anger and retaliation, Sergeant Hayes had chosen a different path, and in doing so, he had changed lives forever. Thomas continued his recovery one day at a time, carrying with him the memory of that pivotal moment when a soldier's quiet strength had shown him who he could become. The palace courtyard where his lowest moment had occurred remained a place of profound significance, not as a reminder of his shame, but as the birthplace of his transformation from the man he had been into the man he was determined to become.